Thank you very much, Stefan, and good evening to everybody. It's a real pleasure to kick off this series. It's a really wonderful lineup, it seems, and I feel slightly daunted being the first to deliver this, and especially at this strange time when we're getting used to video conferencing. I'm certainly not totally used to it yet, so I apologize in advance if there's anything in terms of the IT which I get wrong this evening. I'm hoping it's often quite difficult when we're in the church here at Farm Street and we're giving talks or in meetings. I still find it quite difficult to really know what people are doing on the other side of the camera. That's obvious, isn't it? And it's one of the disadvantages of this way of working. But one of the wonderful advantages is we've got such a large audience this evening, and you're there the other side of that screen. I don't know where exactly in the country or in the world. I suspect most are in the UK. Quite a few have connections with the Christian Heritage Centre through Stonyhurst College, and others will be simply joining us because of the wonderful publicity that Stefan and his team have done online. So it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce this series by speaking about St Ignatius of Loyola. Now, there hasn't been anything in the chat so far, so since I've spoken for about a minute, so I presume that either means no one can hear me or everyone can hear me. So I'm presuming everyone can hear me, and I'm going to go ahead. So I'm sitting in my office at Farm Street Church in London, where the Jesuit church in the heart of London. Many of you will have visited us. So I think that's why I've been invited this evening. I've been a Jesuit for 29 years, and I've been parish priest here for 2 years, but in the community now for nearly 12 years. And we're a big Jesuit operation here with the London Jesuit Centre, with Farm Street Church, and with various other organisations such as Jesuit Media Initiatives. Our archives are here and our provincial offices are here. So because I'm a Jesuit priest and I'm parish priest here, I suppose that's why I've been invited. I'm not a spirituality expert. I'm not a historian. My background's in theology, but I'm a parish priest now at the Jesuit Church in the heart of London, Farm Street. So it's a particular take, I suppose, on Ignatius, but so I'm hoping it will be personal. But I just want to give you a little bit of information about his life, a taste of his spirituality. That's our spirituality, which is so much wider, though, than the Jesuit world, so much wider than the Catholic world now. A little bit also about his own times. And a little, finally, I'm going to refer to about what it might say to us today at this very strange time of the pandemic, and referring specifically to Pope Francis, our Jesuit Pope, himself, of course, a spiritual son of Ignatius. Now, you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to play around with PowerPoint, but you're not going to be seeing me for the whole talk. And I'm hoping that we'll have some interesting discussion afterwards. But I'm also going to give the floor to some videos which the Society of Jesus has prepared on Ignatius. And so, technology allowing, we're now going to listen to a little bit of an introduction to the life of Ignatius, giving us a little bit of a flavour of who he is. Apologies for those who know a lot of this already. I don't know exactly who is there, so I'm going to be giving you information which you may know about his life, with a little bit of comment and contemporary connection later. So I'm going to show this video from the Jesuit Curia in Rome now, which gives us a little taste of the life of Ignatius.
Born Inigo Lopez de la Hoya in 1491, the man known as Ignatius of Loyola was the youngest of 13 children. Despite the misfortune of losing his mother at a young age, he was still a member of the local aristocracy and was raised accordingly. He became ambitious as a youth and wanted to be a great general. By the time he was 18, he had become a soldier. He began referring to himself as Ignatius, a more mature version of his name. He gained a reputation as a duelist. According to one story, he killed a Moor with whom he argued about the divinity of Christ. His skill in combat earned him promotions, and soon he commanded his own troops. In 1521, Ignatius was struck by a cannonball in the legs. To save his life, and possibly his legs, doctors performed several surgeries. After suffering for a month, his doctors warned him to prepare for death. But instead of dying, Ignatius began to improve. During this time, Ignatius began to read about the lives of the saints and Christ. The stories had a profound impact on him. As he lay bedridden, Ignatius developed a desire to become a working servant of Christ. He especially wanted to convert non-Christians. In 1522, he gave his clothes away to a poor man and began a period of work, prayer, and contemplation. Following a short pilgrimage to the Holy Land, Ignatius realized he needed a complete education to convert people. He attended a grammar school for children to learn Latin and other basic subjects. He then traveled to various universities to learn more. Ignatius often engaged others in lengthy conversations about spiritual matters. The Inquisition accused Ignatius of preaching without any formal education in theology. He was questioned 3 times, but his heart was pure, and he was always exonerated. Ignatius decided he needed more education. He was 38 years old when he entered the University of Paris. He earned a master's degree at the age of 44. While at school, Ignatius roomed with Peter Faber and Francis Xavier. The men became friends, and Ignatius led them in spiritual exercises. Other men soon joined their exercises and became followers of Ignatius. The group began to refer to themselves as Friends in the Lord. In 1539, the group went to Rome and presented themselves to the Pope. Pope Paul III approved them as an order in 1540. Ignatius became their first leader. He imposed a strict, almost military rule on his order. Despite the strict rules, the order grew. The order was responsible for much of the work of stopping the spread of the Protestant Reformation. Today, his order is known as the Society of Jesus, and it works in educating the youth around the world. Several universities have been founded in the name of Ignatius and in the traditional Jesuit spirit. Ignatius passed away on July 31st, 1556, at the age of 64. He was beatified by Pope Paul V in 1609 and canonized in 1622 by Gregory XV. His feast day is celebrated on July 31st, and he is the patron saint of the Society of Jesus, soldiers, and educators.
So Ignatius was very much a man of his time. One of the ways in which my parish here of Farm Street is currently introducing who Ignatius is an annual Camino, a walking pilgrimage in his footsteps. Some of you may have done the Santiago de Compostela Camino. It's becoming more and more popular, as are walking pilgrimages in general. This, I think, is a wonderful and also, of course, challenging physically and also fun way of entering into the spirit of who this Ignatius was too. So what I'm hoping to do this evening in my 50 minutes is to whet your appetite a little bit to get to know more about Ignatius. And you've seen the video, a bit about his life, and a bit about the foundation of the Jesuits, the biography of Ignatius, but there are various ways in which we can get to know him. The Camino takes each year, one of 4 stages of walking across Ignatius' own land of Spain. breathing in something of the culture of the places where Ignatius grew up, where he had his principal spiritual experiences, and where he composed the spiritual exercises, which form the heart of what Ignatius gives to us. Ignatius' own autobiography, again, I recommend that you read that to understand more of who Ignatius was, is all about how he is the pilgrim. He calls himself the pilgrim. We've heard a little bit about that journey in the short video, but I want to focus now on the places on this pilgrimage route which we walk from Farm Street, from Loyola in the west to Manresa in the east of what we know now as Spain. And perhaps even whet your appetite to join us sometime. It's a way of getting to know Ignatius better. But the reason why I'm homing in on this to start with, having given you a little about Ignatius' life, is that this is a pilgrimage of the heart in which Ignatius invites us to pray for what he is about. And I would sum that up as being about detachment, about interior freedom, and ultimately to indifference to what life brings me. That's the basis of Ignatius of Loyola's spirituality. So if we were to do more with IT, I might give you a map of Spain at this point, but I want to ask you to do that very Ignatian thing, to use your imagination, to think of that country of Spain, and maybe you've been there yourself to these places, and to imagine yourself in these key places, which are the turning point in Ignatius' life. Now, most of them, it seems to me, are in the last stage of this walking pilgrimage, which Ignatius did himself in 1522. They're in what we know as Catalonia, in the east of Spain. Of course, that's disputed. Catalonia is very much campaigning for independence. And I'm going to focus on two of those places. I'm going to focus on Montserrat and on Manresa. As soon as Ignatius regained his health, we've seen in the video how he was struck down by a cannonball in Pamplona in battle. As soon as he regained his health, the pilgrim, who had the Basque name, remember, originally, as the video told us, Inigo left home in Loyola in the Basque country on pilgrimage, and he was determined there, he said, to serve Christ and the Virgin Mary. He ended up in the east of Spain eventually, in Montserrat, and he ended up before the statue of the Black Madonna at the shrine of Our Lady of Montserrat, an ancient place of pilgrimage where a monastic settlement had flourished for centuries. And the pilgrim spent 3 nights there in prayer. Here, he laid down his sword. If you come with us on the Camino, then you will discover that the sword there is actually a replica. The Benedictines who still run the shrine, the monastery and the choir school is still very much flourishing there. They have a replica of the sword, and that can be venerated along with the shrine, along with the statue of the Black Madonna of Montserrat. The actual sword itself is kept at the shrine of the Sacred Heart in Barcelona, in the church there, where there's a large Jesuit community. What did Ignatius do when he arrived at Montserrat and he spent those 3 nights in prayer? They're key to what Ignatius is all about. Ignatius renounced his former ways, with, as he saw it, all its vanities, and he dedicated himself to his new master, that is Christ. So at the heart of what Ignatius was about is a dramatic conversion of heart. We heard in the video how his life was as a soldier and a courtier. He was vain and ambitious. He was worldly wise. And then in the midst of his life, he's struck by the cannonball at Pamplona. And this sets him off thinking, not just where am I in my life, but what must I do to live a life which is fruitful? And so 3 nights of contemplation, which lead, critically I would say, not to staying at Montserrat and donning a monastic habit and becoming a monk, but critically to carrying on along the road to what was in 1522 and is still now a typical industrial and very multicultural town. That is the town of Manresa. This is the last stage of that pilgrimage which Ignatius made. And he goes on to Manresa, not to now found the Society of Jesus, but having decided to follow Christ and to leave his worldly life behind, he retires to a cave, and it is there that he composes the spiritual exercises at the end of a whole year of discernment. I'm going to focus in now on the Manresa experience, on the time in the cave and in the town of Manresa. And I'm going to show you a video from the Ignatian Spirituality Center in Manresa, which offers retreats in English. We'll say a bit more about Ignatian retreats later, and is the destination point, the final point, where we have a short retreat at the end of the Farm Street Camino in the steps of St Ignatius. So here's a little bit about the cave experience from the Ignatian Spirituality Center in Manresa.
We are situated very near the place where, in the spring of 1522, an inspired man sowed a seed, which was going to blossom into an enormous fruitful tree that was to reach out throughout the universal church. At the outset, its roots did not penetrate the soft foundations of Renaissance culture, but penetrated the hard rock of a cave chosen by this pilgrim to carry out his penances and his profound contemplative prayers. Dressed in sackcloth and practically barefooted, this unknown person came from the monastery and sanctuary of Montserrat to Manresa, where it was his desire to pray all night in true knightly fashion, to carry out the vigil of his newly acquired spiritual arms, having at last discarded both his gentleman's attire and his captain's sword. The first steps of this spirituality took place in Montserrat, where he was so influenced by what he had experienced there that he postponed his plans to travel to the Holy Land and settled in Manresa. This new man divided his time between working at the hospital of Santa Lucia and attending Vespers at the cathedral and praying Matins at the Dominican monastery. People sought him out, both in order to see his acts and to ask for spiritual guidance. The children nicknamed him the man in sackcloth, whilst the very poorest benefited from his attentions. Feeling the need to withdraw from the world, he resorts to the hermitages on the outskirts of the city, until he finally settles in a cave overlooking the Cardener River. His penances are so severe that he falls ill and is looked after by some pious ladies. And whilst this man lies prostrate in a deep lethargy, which may be presumed to be a state of rapture, one may well wonder who this strange person is, who seems mad for the love of God, as the monks, who he was with in Montserrat, described him, and also what his true identity may be. Where did he come from? and how did he arrive at the cave? Inigo Lopez de Loyola and Sainz de Licona, such is his name, was from the Basque country. He's 30 years old and walks with a limp. He was wounded in the war, and his legs were particularly affected. This severe wound was received during the war, defending the Pamplona garrison for the emperor when fighting against the French. Inigo de Loyola fought heroically, as he was in the service of his relation, the Duke of Nájera, whom he had helped in other political missions. As has been said by Pedro de Ribadeneira, his first biographer, young as he was, in the prime of his life, he was very well known as being clever and prudent in affairs of the world, and intelligent at solving problems and differences of opinion. Where did Inigo get this political wisdom and diplomatic experience? As just an adolescent, he had been trained in court life by Juan Velázquez de Cuellar, head purser to the king. Leaving his parents and his many brothers and sisters, he lived for 10 years in a village called Arevalo, alternating military training with courtly refinements. Thus, this young man, both vigorous and refined, as his first biographer describes him, dreams of imitating the chivalric models of Amadis de Gaula and Tirán lo Blanc, highly desirous of gaining honour, but to no avail, as he himself recalls years later. Page boy and courtier up to the age of 25, both a military man and a diplomat at an early age, everything seemed to predict a glorious future, both in military affairs and worldly ones. But the wound received in Pamplona and endless months of convalescence were to totally change his future. Bored with books of chivalry, he becomes an avid reader of the lives of the saints. Above all, he had a great desire to travel to the Holy Land, so as to become better acquainted with the life of Jesus, his new master, and so he set out. Manresa did not come into his plans, but what was to have been just a stopping place became a founding place, his primitive church, as he would call it many years later. Now we know who we are dealing with, and whence this strange visitor came from. We would look for him without success in the streets of Manresa, and finally find him taking refuge once again in the cave, engrossed in profound prayer and contemplation, and undergoing his dark nights of the soul. Ignatius, having overcome his severe penances and serious health disorders, has a visit from God himself, and is illumined as to the mysteries of the Christian faith. The presence of Jesus is so intense during this time that he himself explains years later that it was as if I saw Jesus with his own eyes and felt with his hands. During this period, he begins to understand that one must feel and taste interiorly the presence of Jesus in order to give oneself up entirely and without reserve to him. His most important experience is the illumination he receives by the river Cardona, which offered him the means to understand many aspects of spiritual life, of faith and his readings, to such an extent that he saw all things as fresh and new. So profound was his experience that afterwards he seemed to be an entirely new man, a new person, with a different intellect and understanding to that he had had previously. Ignatius will always remember Manresa as his primitive church, the place where his new birth into God comes about. The spiritual exercises, which were to become famous throughout the church, have their origin in these personal mystical experiences. During the following 20 years, he will continue to draw up a new method of prayer and discernment to discover how God calls each individual. The question that this knightly penitent often posed was, what should I do from now on in order to serve my new and only Lord? How should I plan my life so as to discover God's will more easily? How do I get to know Jesus better and in such a manner as to consecrate not only my memory, my intelligence and my will to him, but all my freedom, only desiring God's love and God's grace.
The spiritual exercises. Note that in summarizing Ignatius' early life up to that point and the spiritual exercises, I'm not going to give an explanation of what the spiritual exercises are. It might be a question which many people have. But Ignatius, although Ignatius and his spiritual exercises are so intertwined with each other, the best way to learn about the spiritual exercises is to do them. This is really important. And indeed, I want this evening, of course, to signpost various possibilities, directed retreats. Many of you will have visited St Bino's, where you can do long and short retreats. You can do them physically present, and you can do, now just opened again, and you can do them remotely. Retreats in daily life becoming increasingly popular, have done over the last 30, 40 years or so. And of course, the Camino is a new way to do this. But I want to move on now from Ignatius up to the point of Manresa, the pilgrim at the end of this journey, composing the spiritual exercise, as I think for this audience, you would want to hear something of the link between Ignatius and the order he founded, which indeed founded the school associated with the Christian Heritage Centre, Stonyhurst, in 1594. And so very much in living memory of this man, Inigo de Loyola, who was to become St Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the company that is in English, the Society of Jesus. So what about Ignatius and the Jesuits? Inigo's great desire became to help others see the Lord working in the ordinary events of their own lives, just as he had experienced that. At the beginning, we're talking about back in the 1520s and 1530s, his work was frequently looked upon with suspicion by the church authorities, who saw heresy lurking behind the spiritual exercises. Now, the historical side of Ignatius throws up a real interest in how the Europe of the time was in the throes of the Reformation, and Ignatius was very much part of that, of course. He felt that the best way to be allowed to teach in the church was by studying philosophy and theology, and then responding to the call to become a priest. So that's why the pilgrim, as he called himself, settled down to life again as a student. In Barcelona, at the age of 33, he went back to studies and joined classes of boys to learn Latin, the language of the universities. In 1526, when he'd mastered the basics of Latin, he moved to Alcalá University to study philosophy. He continued giving the spiritual exercises during this time of study. But now comes a very interesting episode in the pre-Jesuits, the pre-Jesuit foundation life of Ignatius. Inigo, now at this point in his life calling himself in the Latin Ignatius, fell foul of the Spanish Inquisition. He was imprisoned in 1527 for teaching religion before completion of the required training. A training which of course would have been based on the rational philosophy and theology of the medieval schools. Upon release from prison, Ignatius the student moved from Spain to the freer atmosphere of Paris and the Sorbonne. But I want to make it clear that Ignatius was not an academic as such. Most will not be surprised at that who are listening this evening, but some may. Indeed, great Jesuit academics would come later. The Jesuits have a particular interest in academic work. But Ignatius had little interest in the Reformation debates on grace and justification, the process of how we're saved, with much of the debate around the Protestant and counter, or which much of the debate on the Protestant and counter or Catholic Reformation was about. Of course, in Paris and in Barcelona beforehand, he would have known of Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, but it's just not a theme for this man, the pilgrim Ignatius, despite how we might think we can read into the spiritual exercises with 21st century ecumenical eyes. He wasn't actually influenced by Luther's emphasis on how God justifies us by faith alone with works. Rather, Ignatius was interested, as I said at the beginning of the talk, in the movement of the heart. That's what he's about. And so he's interested in what the Montserrat and the Manresa experience is about, what pilgrimage is about. He's interested in making choices between what is following God and what is following the evil one. And this was new and appealing amid the turbulence of 16th century Christendom. This attracted followers in the exciting world of 16th century Paris. And so Ignatius gathered about him young men whom he fired with enthusiasm to serve the Lord. And so he gave the spiritual exercises while continuing his studies of philosophy in Paris. And that's where he gained followers. Now, an interesting little aside: to finance his studies, he'd spend a little time each year in Flanders begging for alms. And this is interesting, to me certainly, in the summer of 1530, he went further afield to London. I'd really love to know where he did that, where he lived, but there's no information as far as we know. We do know that before the first Jesuits landed back on English soil in the second half of the 16th century to go to their almost certain martyrdom, Ignatius had spent time in London, 4 years before the Act of Supremacy declared Henry VIII as head of the church, 5 years before the martyrdom of John Fisher and Thomas More, and 9 full years before the dissolution of the monasteries, which destroyed the fabric of British Catholicism. What we do know is the generous Londoners gave him much more than he collected previously, sufficient in fact to keep him for the whole year. Now, at this point, the Reformation isn't really happening as fully as it will later. We haven't got the Protestantization of the Protestant countries of Europe yet. At this time, in 1534, just as the Act of Supremacy is being signed in England, Ignatius is back in Paris. And on the Feast of the Assumption, 15th of August, 1534, one of their number, Pierre Favre, already a priest and now one of the companions, said Mass, celebrated Mass in a chapel on the slopes of Montmartre, where all the companions took vows of poverty and chastity, and further promised that upon completion of their studies, they would make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and they agreed to meet in Venice to embark from there. Venice is the next stage in the journey I want you to imagine. This is a really important episode in the history of the movement which will lead to the foundation of the Jesuits. The agreed meeting took place in Venice, but the companions waited in vain for a pilgrim ship to the Holy Land, which is where Ignatius had decided they all must go. The normal dangers of wind and the weather, added to the war with the Turks, meant that they simply couldn't sail. And it was during this time in Venice, in these years, that Ignatius and those of the companions who weren't yet priests were ordained on the feast of the birth of John the Baptist, 24th June 1537. In July 1537, the companions now left Venice for nearby Vicenza, and it's there that they exercised their priestly ministry with the citizens of that beautiful city. Early in 1538, the companions, whose number had now grown to 9, decided that they must go to Rome, finally to put themselves at the disposal of the Holy Father. And it was during this journey that Ignatius had his second major spiritual experience. Remember, the first was in Manresa at the end of his pilgrimage in front of the river Cardener, where he understood all things. And now, rather like St Thomas Aquinas at the end of his life, Now he had a memorable vision for Ignatius, where God the Father placed him with his Son carrying his cross, saying, "I will be faithful to you in Rome." Following Christ crucified, Ignatius now continued to Rome and said he had now understood all things. Ignatius and his companions considered long, hard, and prayerfully whether to band together formally. Eventually, the decision was that they will be more effective together than apart. And so in 1540, with the blessing of Pope Paul III, the Society of Jesus was born. They dedicated themselves to teaching, to preaching the word of God, to working with the poor and the sick in the slums of the cities of Europe, and to traveling to far-flung destinations as missionaries to preach Christ to people in lands new to European eyes. This new religious order had chosen to be flexible, and this is where Ignatius, as a man of his times, fits in with this new age of reform, of Catholic reform and the Reformation. Gone was the monastic meeting, together many times daily to sing God's praises as a community. Gone too was the requirement of wearing a distinctive habit. Now each man worshipped God in the way he found best and was totally free to respond to the needs of those around him. The Jesuit community was, for many, maintained over vast distances by means of letters. They were to be educated men who could debate with the reformers on their own terms, men who would not be seduced by worldly power and wealth, men who sought to convert whole nations to Christianity, willing to do anything for the greater glory of God. With falling numbers today, this will surely be more necessary and prevalent again. We hope, if we're not too naive. With God's grace, gone are the days of large Jesuit communities, in England at least, at places like Stonyhurst or even at Farm Street. Ignatius was, of course, the first superior general of the Society of Jesus. And so this man, who had started his life in the Basque Country and who had had this conversion experience, is now tied to an office desk in Rome, writing letters to men who, like Francis Xavier, matched him in fame. Letters which encouraged, which made requests, which chided. Letters telling of everyday events and of outstanding feats. And it's here that Ignatius died in 1556, as we've heard, in the Gesù, the Jesuit church in the center of Rome, which was founded at this time. And indeed, if you visit Rome, then do go along and visit the rooms. They're open in the afternoons, I think every day, probably not at the moment because of the pandemic, but if you make inquiries beforehand on the website, just type in sjweb.info and you'll go into the Jesuit Curia in Rome website and you'll find information about visiting the rooms of St Ignatius. They are as they were on the day, not quite on the day that Ignatius died, but all of his belongings from that time are left in the room. It's a great place to celebrate Mass. Now, time is moving on, and we said 50 minutes to an hour. I'm going to take another 10 minutes, in fact, if that's okay. We did say up to an hour, I think, because I do want now, having gone through Ignatius' biography, given you a little taste of the spiritual exercises, given you a sense of him as a man of his own time, as a man of this time in history of the Reformation and the timeline of his life, whetted your appetite for who he is as a spiritual guru and as the founder of the Jesuits. I want now just to answer the question a little bit of what might Ignatius say to us today. And this may indeed inspire interesting questions. I'm going to home in on 3 gifts, which it seems to me Ignatius can give to us at this time, all of which we can discern a key at this specific time in the church and world, at this key turning point, as our Holy Father Francis calls us to rebuild church and society in what he says is not an era of change, but change of era. Firstly, and perhaps fundamental, Ignatius teaches me the gift of discernment. And this, I think, is something Pope Francis is bringing specifically to our church and our world. A discernment which is not just individual, but a discernment which is communal, engaging as many in the church as possible through a synodal form of government he's developing in the church. What is discernment then? On an individual level, for the retreatant doing the spiritual exercises, Ignatius talks not just of making that choice of decision, but of discernment of spirits. This is something it's best to learn through doing, as I've said. We do this through the rhythm of prayer, reflection, and conversation on our Camino. But you would also learn this on a retreat at St Bino's, or in a retreat in daily life, or a week of guided prayer, which can be organised by the Jesuits in Britain and our co-workers. What is this about, discernment? It's about taking a long step back in order to move forward, just as Ignatius did in Manresa. Taking time out to listen to our heart as we reflect on our journey in life. Ignatius invites us to spend that time in prayer, in reflection, pondering the experiences of life and asking myself, where do I find peace and where do I find my heart is less at peace or restless? He speaks in terms of the presence of the good spirit and of the bad spirit. And we're called to train ourselves to choose what gives life and not to listen to what calls us away from that. And this, as Pope Francis is bearing out, is also a tool to be applied to communal decisions, group decisions, even global decisions. The Pope is bringing us back at this extraordinary time to learn from this time when we've been locked down. And I find that really inspiring. Our Jesuit Pope, a spiritual son of St Ignatius, is bringing the gift of Ignatian discernment to this critical time of pandemic, to a change of era. Francis stresses how, although, and very importantly, this time is not directly sent by God, as how can God, who is all good, ordain or allow that there be so much destruction in our world to bring about something good? That's not the case. However, we're always called to learn. For Ignatius, this is key. We're called to learn from this time. It's a time of everything being on pause, Pope Francis says. A time of everything being on hold in our world, as in the Manresa experience. A time, like on our Camino, like on a retreat, to ask myself and ourselves as the human race, where has the good spirit been? And where has the bad spirit been? I'm meeting people at this moment as parish priest here, who at this time have been very lonely, who've been full of anxiety, who've been full of fear. I think all these emotions have been around for so many. And getting in touch with this has inspired them to ask myself what really matters in life, to listen carefully to my heart and see what is life-giving there. Some I hear are stirred to take a different course in life, maybe to search for a partner, to change jobs, to think about my future. But also on the collective scale, it's time to ask, how have we destroyed our resources on this earth? How we destroy each other? Where is the good spirit there? Are we inspired to learn from this time and commit to something altogether more life-giving for our world? A care for creation, which sees how everyone and everything is interconnected and has an innate dignity which deserves respect. The heart of Pope Francis' encyclical letter, Laudato Si, praise be to him. At the root of it, discernment in common, leading to decision which builds a better future for our world. Now, the second of the three gifts, the second thing, which many might feel slightly strange and new, but it's there in our Holy Father's spirituality as it is in Ignatius. Ignatius can teach us that this discernment will often require of us to make a clear choice, as Ignatius did at Montserrat, a choice between good and evil. Ignatius' principle of the spirit in the spiritual exercises of the two standards of the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness are key here. There's a recognition of a kingdom of God and a kingdom of the evil one, of light and darkness, of right and wrong. Pope Francis has a particularly keen sense of this. You'll hear him so often refer to this stark choice in a simple way: the existence of evil over which the good must triumph. And during this time of pandemic, he's been calling the church back to this, to use this time to place myself and my world behind the standard of good. A copy of all of the messages, the general audiences and the homilies of Pope Francis during the pandemic is available for free on the Vatican website, by the way. The two standards in the spiritual exercises, the choice made at Montserrat between a worldly life and one which is about detachment, freedom, indifference. The two standards seems to be for Francis how discernment bites, as it's not simply looking at my life and saying what's been good and what's been less than good, and recognizing that in society, discerning the signs of the times. But it's more than that. It's saying I choose the standard of good so as to rebuild the kingdom, the church, in the midst of so much evil, which has been present through the scandal of child sexual abuse and corruption and clericalism, and to rebuild our world in the midst of how we plunder the earth and destroy each other through wars and conflicts. Francis keeps reminding us we're not just to discern where the good is in this era of change, as he calls it, but actually rebuild in this era of change, to take control of the future. Discernment then is not just working out with the light of God's Spirit where I am and where things are in a preordained plan from God. Yes, God has a plan, but more important, I believe, is the freedom he gives us. The heart of God is his infinite love for us, which is infinite freedom for us to respond. And so because God loves us so much, he gives the human race the capacity to rebuild. So we don't take time to pray, to reflect, to look into ourselves, but to look outwards. I've seen that so much at this time in people around here, certainly. The many people who've been involved in this parish and others in central London in our emergency homeless service. This, I feel for myself, has been a clear choice of the standard of the kingdom of God rather than that of the evil one, which draws us more into ourselves in selfishness, egoism, scapegoating, obfuscating. And so a final point, a third gift which Ignatius might give us. They're all connected, of course. And that is that contemplation is never static, it's dynamic. It's never passive, it leads to action. Remember, Ignatius spent 3 nights before the Madonna at Montserrat and decided to go on. Yes, to discern much more. That's not to say that the monastic vocation is important in the world. It's vital in the world. I spend many of my own annual retreats in a monastery, and Ignatius, I think, would promote that. But following Ignatian discernment, we want to follow on Christ by following him all the way to the cross and always doing more for God in the world. For those who follow the spirituality of our founder, Ignatius, we strive then to be contemplatives in action. And that's really the last point I'd want to make as the key to Ignatius and his spirituality. This is a different understanding of contemplation to other spiritual greats and to the monastic tradition. It's a contemplation which, the more we contemplate, the more we're called to respond to that question, what more shall I do for God? This time of pandemic has certainly in London, in my parish, given much opportunity for contemplation, and I hope it has for you. Question coming out of that for Ignatius and for Pope Francis is, what more am I being asked to do for God now? As individuals, as church, as society. All of this, of course, rests not on the spiritual exercises as such, not on the life of Ignatius himself, but on the teachings of Christ. It's for that reason that Ignatius called the new movement, which Pope Paul III approved in 1540, the Company of Jesus, the Society of Jesus as we know it. It is the God whom Pope Francis reminds us through his motto, loves us as sinners. That's the heart of the first week of the spiritual exercises. The God who is all merciful loves us and chooses us to be fruitful, who is at the center, as he calls us outwards to serve others. I think that that's the hour exactly up. So I'm going to end there, and I'm very happy to hear any comments or any questions and see who's on the other side of this camera. Thank you.